A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon. Juliet Smith from our sister station in Eugene spoke with one of the professors to learn more.
Deep beneath the dry soil of a cave in southern Oregon, a team of archaeologists uncovered something that should not exist. They sent it to the lab, and the date that came back was so strange, they thought the equipment had failed. So they tested it again using another sample on another machine. Then a third time. Every result pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. Whoever left this behind was standing on American soil thousands of years before history says any human was here. And what Oregon revealed next does not simply rewrite the story of human origins. It destroys it. The Oregon Cave. Stay inside that cave with me for a moment. It is called the Paisley Caves, a series of dry rock shelters in south-central Oregon. And here is the part nobody wants to admit. Researchers had known about the site for decades. They simply never dug deep enough, never searched carefully enough. Everyone believed the answer to the question of the first Americans was already settled, printed, framed, and displayed on the wall. So, why bother digging another layer in a dusty cave in the middle of nowhere? And when a University of Oregon team finally moved through the layers of the cave floor, what they uncovered was not a spear point. It was not a tool. It was preserved human waste, dried and hardened, resting exactly where a person left it thousands of years ago, right there, undisturbed, for all those years.
Has long been a matter of spirited debate. As Stephanie Sy reports, a recent study detailing what archaeologists believe are the oldest known footprints in the United States is sparking new questions and upending long-held assumptions.
A discovery that ordinary does not make the evening news, and it does not get its own museum gallery. But the dry desert air of the high Oregon Plateau had accomplished something no laboratory on Earth could do. It kept that delicate organic material preserved century after century while everything else that ever lived in that cave decayed away into nothing. And trapped inside it was something a stone tool can never reveal. Not a shape, not a theory, human DNA. They sequenced the mitochondrial DNA, and the result left absolutely no room for doubt. It matched the Native American founding haplogroups A2 and B2. Not some failed migration that wandered in and disappeared. The direct ancestors of indigenous people living in America right now. People with names, with families, with a bloodline reaching straight back into the soil of a cave most of the world has never heard about. Think about that for a second, because this is the part that raises the stakes. This was not a curiosity behind a glass case. It was evidence in living genetic code that the oldest chapter of the American story never ended. That lineage is still here. The people who lived in that cave were not a dead end, not a doomed group that arrived too early and disappeared without a trace. Their descendants survived the Ice Age, survived the melting glaciers, survived thousands of years of upheaval, and they are walking around today. And the evidence of the oldest known chapter of human life on this continent was not a temple or a golden artifact. It was the most ordinary thing a human body leaves behind, dried on a cave floor, hiding in the one kind of evidence no archaeologist ever places on a poster. Then they dated it. The method was accelerator mass spectrometry, which measures the age of the organic material itself, not the dirt surrounding it. That difference matters more than it sounds because the usual objection to an impossibly old discovery is that the object slipped down from a younger layer, or the dirt became mixed, or the sample was contaminated. This method cuts directly past all of that. It dates the thing in your hand according to its own age. Calibrated, the result came back at more than 14,000 years before the present. At least 1,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have arrived at all. You have to understand what that changes. For most of the 20th century, every textbook taught the same neat story. The first Americans were the Clovis people, named for the fluted spear points discovered at a site in New Mexico. Those distinctive blades with a groove down the center that made them lighter and deadlier. The story said they crossed a frozen land bridge from Asia around 13,000 years ago, moved south through a gap in the ice, and spread across an empty continent. First to arrive, nothing before them. It was clean, it was teachable, and it was wrong. Careers were built around it. Entire museum halls were organized around it, with the Clovis hunters standing proudly at the front of the human story on this land. To question the date was not simply to question a number. It was to tell many important people that the thing they had defended their entire lives was a fairy tale. Oregon just put 1,000 years between Clovis and the truth. The Clovis people were not first. They were not even close, and Oregon was not finished. One date from one cave is exactly the kind of thing the old guard can dismiss as a fluke, a strange result, contamination, bad luck. They have done it before, plenty of times. But 70 miles from this cave, a second Oregon site was about to take the date Paisley found and push it into something much older and far harder to explain away. Not a fluke this time, a pattern. And patterns are what end careers. If this is already getting under your skin, hit subscribe right now, because what a University of Oregon archaeologist pulled from the ground 70 miles away is worse. This is where it stops being about a date and starts being about who these people really were. Rimrock Draw. 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, outside the town of Riley in Harney County, there is a place called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. Dr. Patrick O'Grady, a University of Oregon archaeologist, has been excavating there since 2011. If you have ever pictured archaeology as one dramatic discovery, this is the opposite. For years, the site revealed almost nothing. A few obsidian flakes, a groundstone tool sitting near the front of the shelter, and a scattered fragments that seemed almost meaningless at first glance.
The real artifact, this is real. This was touched by somebody 12,000 years ago, and that's when it really clicked for me. I was like, yeah.
The kind of slow, knees in the dirt, brush and screen work that never makes a documentary. Year after year, season after season, with no promise any of it would ever become something. Rimrock Draw did not give them Dina. It gave them a clock. Buried beneath the soil was a layer of white ash, and scientists matched it to a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens, dated to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago.
Beneath you somewhere, there's water. So if something hot comes up into that water, it heats it up. It can build up enough pressure that it finally just breaks through as an explosion, like a pressure cooker, just letting loose.
That ash is the rule for the entire site. Anything found beneath it is older. Anything above it is younger. There is no debating it, no moving the layers around. A volcano 1,000 miles away had erupted, spread its ash across the landscape, and sealed a lid over time itself. Everything beneath that lid had been waiting there since before the ash fell. And this is why Rimrock Draw matters so much beside Paisley. The cave gave the field a date and a strand of DNA, and skeptics could always whisper about contamination or a sample slipping down through the layers. But a volcanic ash layer is not something you can easily argue with. It is a hard line drawn through the soil by an event nobody could fake. Whatever sits below it is older than the eruption, period. So, when the team began finding things beneath that ash, they were not asking the lab to simply trust them. They were asking it to trust the volcano. And beneath that lid, O'Grady's team began pulling out things that should not have been there. 27 tiny fragments of tooth enamel sifted from the soil one by one. One of them belonged to an ancient camel, an Ice Age species that once roamed North America and has been extinct for thousands of years. Another belonged to Bison antiquus, a larger, heavier ancestor of the modern American buffalo, also long gone. These were not animals that wandered through recent history. These were creatures from a vanished world, the megafauna of the last ice age. And there they were, buried under the same ash, in the same ground a human tool would soon appear in, right there in that ancient shelter. The picture forming in that trench was of a landscape most people cannot even imagine standing inside. Camels and giant bison moving across what is now the Oregon High Desert. And somewhere among them, a person with a knife. Then came the tool. Orange chalcedony, a glassy form of agate that catches the light, shaped into a single implement with a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, and a saw-toothed edge worn smooth. O'Grady called it an early Swiss Army knife, one tool made to handle several jobs. And the detail that gets beneath your skin is the wear. The little teeth along that serrated edge were polished, and that kind of polish does not happen in a week or a month. It takes a lifetime of use. Somebody carried this thing for years, sharpened it, resharpened it, cut, scraped, sawed, and cut again until one day they left it in that shelter and for whatever reason never came back for it. You are not looking at a rock. You are looking at the favorite possession of a person who lived and died unimaginably long ago. A tool worn smooth by the same kind of daily use that wears a handle or a key smooth today. That is the strange intimacy of a place draw. Across 20,000 years, you can still see the shape of one person's habits in the polish on a blade. Here is the part that matters. The tool sat about 10 cm below the camel teeth. Deeper means older. So, the tool was older than the animals, and when the lab tested the animal teeth, the camel and bison came back at roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. O'Grady did not trust it. He tested it again. Same window. 2 samples, 2 independent tests, 2 identical results. Picture him sitting there with that second matching date in front of him. The one he had quietly hoped would talk him out of the first. It did the opposite. It confirmed it. He later admitted it was extremely frightening to be holding material that old. You do not announce something like that without something solid to stand on because you know exactly what happens to the careers of people who get it wrong. He had watched it happen to others. Now he had 2 matching dates, and there was no talking his way out of it. The animals at Rimrock Draw had died more than 18,000 years ago, and the worn knife buried beneath them said a person had been there even earlier, and that knife was not Clovis. It belongs to something called the Western stem tradition. Long blades, weak shoulders, rounded bases. It looks nothing like a Clovis point, and it predates the Clovis style by thousands of years. That is the quiet bombshell buried inside the date. For decades, the assumption was that every ancient tool in the Americas had to come from Clovis, because Clovis was supposed to be the source, the beginning, the first hand to shape stone on this continent. But a tradition that looks nothing like Clovis and is older than Clovis could not have come from Clovis. It means a separate people with their own techniques, their own way of understanding a piece of stone were already here. Different hands, different rules, a separate root growing in the darkness beneath the official story. So, Oregon now had 2 sites, 2 methods, and 1 impossible message. But if people this old were standing in Oregon, the question stops being whether the textbook is wrong. It becomes how they arrived and how far back this really goes, because the next clue did not come from Oregon. It came from a warning that had been screaming on the other side of the country for decades, and nobody listened. The first crack. Decades before anyone dug deep at Paisley, the first crack had already appeared in a sandstone rock shelter in western Pennsylvania called Meadowcroft, beside a stream about 7 miles up from the Ohio River. One archaeologist later described it as a place with all the attractions of a prehistoric vacation, exactly the kind of sheltered, comfortable overhang where ancient travelers would have stopped for the night without giving it a second thought. In 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller reached into a groundhog hole on the property and pulled out artifacts that had no business being there. One handful of dirt scooped from an animal burrow, the first loose thread of the whole mystery. In 1973, a scientist named Jim Ottavasio started excavating the shelter floor, peeling it back 1 careful layer at a time. And the deeper he went, the older it became. Stratum after stratum, the human presence kept going down further than the textbook said it had any right to go. This was not a man chasing some wild theory. He was simply following the dirt down, recording what was there. And the dirt kept telling him the same thing the deeper he listened. When the radiocarbon dates came back, humans had been at Meadowcroft as early as 16 to 19,000 calibrated calendar years ago, thousands of years before Clovis. In July 1980, Ottavasio published it in American Antiquity and said the quiet part out loud. The Clovis First model was wrong. And his colleagues came after him. Some accused him of contaminating samples. Others simply acted like the paper did not exist, which in science is its own kind of insult. Imagine being the man holding the right dates while a field decides you must be the one who made a mistake. The resistance was so stubborn, so emotionally invested, that researchers eventually gave it a name, Clovis primacy syndrome, and described its continued defense as anachronistic and futile. It worked, too. That is the uncomfortable part. Resistance like that is supposed to fade as the evidence piles up, but this one dug in for the long haul. Even now, decades later, one survey of working archaeologists found that only about 38% agreed with Ottavasio's dates. Another 38% were unsure. The rest still reject them outright. Read those numbers again. A finding that is held up for over 40 years still cannot win over more than a third of the field. Not because the evidence is weak, but because admitting it means rewriting the careers and reputations of the people casting the votes. So, when Oregon's caves and Oregon's ash layer arrived, the field was already cracked down the middle. Ottavasio had taken the hits decades earlier alone on the other side of the country. Oregon was the evidence that made it impossible to keep looking away. The second voice that proved the first had been right all along. And the moment you accept the timeline is broken, a worse question opens up. Because 700 miles south of Oregon, in a white desert nobody had bothered to map, there were footprints, 61 of them. And the people who left them were never supposed to exist. Ghost tracks in the White Sands. White Sands National Park is a field of pale gypsum dunes in southern New Mexico, so white and so silent it barely seems like it belongs on this planet. In 2009, researchers crossing the dried bed of an ancient lake known as Lake Otero noticed shapes pressed into the gypsum. At first glance, nothing dramatic, just impressions in the hard pale ground. But the closer they looked, the clearer it became. Footprints, human footprints, and not one or two. 61 of them. They were incredibly clear. You can see the toes. You can see the curve of the arch. Some are tiny, the size of a child's foot. Others belong to adults moving quickly, almost running. This is not the abstract evidence of a stone or a bone. This is a moment. A group of people, children included, walking along the edge of an Ice Age lake on an ordinary day, leaving prints in soft mud that the sun then baked hard and sediment buried, preserving them in the darkness until someone finally walked across them again thousands of years later. You are not simply reading about these people. You are standing in their footsteps. They were here, alive, mid-stride, heading somewhere at a moment the textbook insists no human being had set foot on this continent at all. The first dates arrived in 2021 from radiocarbon on the seeds of a plant called spiral ditch grass, found in the same layers as the prints, 21,000 to 23,000 years old. Skeptics attacked, and to be fair, they raised a genuine objection. The seeds could have absorbed old carbon from groundwater and appeared falsely ancient. That is exactly the kind of challenge good science is supposed to survive. So, the team tested again, this time with conifer pollen, which does not absorb groundwater carbon and comes directly from trees that were alive at the time. Same answer, 21 to 23,000. Then, in June 2025, a third study in Science Advances approached it from a new angle, using organic material from wetland mud and shallow lake sediments. 3 independent sources now: seeds, pollen, and mud. Each tested separately. All 3 landed in the same window, the height of the last ice age, exactly when the textbook swears North America was empty. And those people were not alone. Their prints run alongside the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous Ice Age animals that disappeared from the continent thousands of years ago, preserved in the same ancient mud at the same moment. human and beast side by side sharing a shoreline that the textbook insisted no human had ever seen. This is what Oregon unleashed. 2 Oregon sites had already pushed the date backward, and once the field had to take Oregon seriously, the rest of the evidence stopped looking like a chain of mistakes and started looking like a pattern. White sands now showed whole families walking the continent deep in the Ice Age, nowhere near any frozen corridor, at a time when the old map says the doorway into America had not even opened yet. But White Sands tops out around 23,000 years. There is something in Southern California so much older it makes White Sands seem modern, and nobody was even searching for it. They were building a freeway. The freeway dig. A freeway crew in Southern California was cutting through soil when the bulldozer struck bone. Work stopped. Nobody was searching for anything. There were no archaeologists on site, no research grant, no plan. Just workers and machines and a road that needed building. The foreman walked over to a curved shape in the dirt that was clearly not a rock and not a pipe. It was the unmistakable shape of something that had once been alive. Paleontologists were called in, and what they pulled out were the partial remains of a single mastodon, an elephant-like animal that went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. But the bones had not simply fallen there and fossilized in peace. As the team brushed the dirt away, piece by piece, the unease spread among the people standing around that pit. They were not examining a fossil. They were examining a scene. Something had been done to these bones, deliberately. The mastodon bone showed spiral fractures, the kind of break that only happens to fresh bone. This is the detail that turns a fossil into a crime scene. Old fossilized bone is dry and brittle, and when it breaks, it shatters. Fresh bone, bone with life still inside it, twists and spirals as it breaks. Someone had cracked these open while they were still fresh, almost certainly to reach the marrow inside, the rich fatty food that prehistoric people valued. This was not scavenging or chance. This was butchery, a known technique performed by someone who understood exactly how to get the most from a carcass. And scattered among the bones were 5 large cobbles, fist-sized stones far too heavy to have washed in by water. Geologists checked. Water had not carried them there. People had. Hammerstones and anvils carried to the spot, used to break the bones open, and then abandoned in the dirt when whoever did it simply walked away and never returned. Here is the number that empties the room. The bone was dated through uranium-thorium analysis, and every single test produced the same result, around 130,700 years old. Read it twice, because it does not belong in the same sentence as everything you have heard so far. 130,700 years. To put that into perspective, the oldest discovery we have discussed until now, the Cerruti bones aside, was around 23,000 years. This is more than 5 times older than that. It is older than our own species is widely believed to have spread out of Africa. It is a number so far outside the accepted timeline that for years the easiest thing to do was assume it had to be wrong. In 2017, Nature published it. The authors, Stephen Holen, Kathleen Holen, Thomas Demmer, and Richard Fulligar, wrote it in the most cautious, hedged technical language they could find, and it still exploded like a bomb. Some kind of human species was in North America 130,700 years ago. Not modern humans, not Neanderthals, something the existing models do not even have a name for. Most of the field simply refuses to engage with the site. Not because they have disproved it, but because it is too radical, too difficult to explain, and too costly to too many careers to even confront. It is easier to look away. So, the question simply hangs there, unanswered, the way uncomfortable questions in science often do. Who broke open those bones? Nobody knows. Nobody can even reasonably speculate. It was not a modern human because modern humans were not supposed to be anywhere near the Americas that early. It was not a Neanderthal. It was some other branch of the human family in California more than 100,000 years before the story is supposed to begin doing something as intimate and human as cracking a bone for the marrow inside. But it leaves Oregon's discovery sitting inside a much larger and stranger picture. If Oregon proved people were here long before Clovis, California is whispering that someone or something was here 100,000 years before that, which pulls us straight back to the question Oregon could not answer by itself. How did any of them get here? Because the old answer, the one frozen doorway out of Siberia, is beginning to fall apart. A different doorway. For a century, the answer was one word: Beringia. The land bridge from Siberia revealed when so much of the world's water was trapped in ice. One doorway opening once, everyone walking through on foot, north to south, exactly the way the textbook diagram always showed it, with a single neat arrow. It was simple, and simple is easy to teach. But Oregon's Western STEM tools do not resemble anything that came through that corridor, and that is the loose thread that, once you pull it, begins unraveling the entire map. If the oldest toolmakers in Oregon were not carrying the Clovis toolkit that supposedly came through that door, then maybe they never came through that door at all. Start with a place that should have made it impossible. Crete Island has been an island for about 5 million years, never once connected to the mainland throughout the entire time humans have existed. There is no walking to Crete. There never was. Anyone who reached it had to cross at least 40 miles of open sea, and not on a log that happened to drift the right direction, but in a real boat deliberately built by someone who understood the water. And a team led by Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou found stone tools at 2 sites on Crete that are between 130,000 and 700,000 years old. Resembling tools made by Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, human ancestors from long before modern humans existed. If they could cross the Mediterranean that early, then the comfortable belief that early humans could not handle open water was finished, and that assumption was load-bearing. The entire reason everyone insisted the first Americans had to walk was the belief that ancient people simply could not cross open ocean, that boats were a late, modern, sophisticated invention. Crete says otherwise. Crete says people were building seaworthy craft 100,000 years before anyone believed they could, as one of the team explained. If early humans could move around the Mediterranean before 130,000 years ago, they could cross other water too. That single sentence reopens every migration map ever drawn. Now, bring it back across the world. Researchers tracing a mitochondrial lineage called D4H followed it to the northern coast of China, and the data did not reveal one migration. It revealed 2. The first wave, around 26,000 years ago, most likely followed the coastline by boat, moving from China up through Japan and out across the Pacific, camp by camp, following the fish and shellfish and tides. Not a desperate crossing, but a slow, patient drift along the edge of a continent, one temporary settlement at a time, perhaps over many generations. Picture it. Small groups living along the shore, never far from sight of land. The children of one camp growing up to paddle a little farther than their parents ever did. No single heroic voyage, just the sea and time and a coastline that kept going. The second wave, around 15,000 years ago, took the land route across Beringia, and that second group is the one connected to the Clovis-era populations. Everyone once crowned the first Americans. They were not first. They were latecomers, following a path others had already traveled by sea thousands of years earlier. Think about what that does to the entire image we grew up with. The Clovis hunters with their spear points, the ones at the very front of every museum diorama, were not the pioneers breaking into an empty world. They were arriving late to a continent that had already been explored, settled, and crossed by people who came through a completely different route. The heroes of the old story turn out to be the latecomers, and the tools agree. The same stoneworking methods appear across China, Japan, and the Americas. The same blades, the same points. The same decisions about how to take a piece of stone and turn it into an edge. That is not coincidence. Tools do not create themselves the same way twice in places thousands of miles apart. That is a trail, A line of people carrying the same craft with them across the water, and it leads straight back to the coast of China, the same separate tradition Oregon's western stem tools belong to. The knife beneath the ash at Rimrock Draw was not a curiosity. It was a clue pointing across an ocean. So, the neat story is gone. The first Americans were not who we were told. They did not arrive when we were told. They may not have even walked. A row of dry caves in Oregon cracked the date open. A worn knife beneath volcanic ash pushed it deeper. And footprints in New Mexico, broken bones in California, and Na from coastal China all followed the same impossible truth Oregon found first. The continent was not empty and waiting. It was already inhabited, already crossed, already home to people whose story stretches far older, far stranger, and far more tangled than anyone wanted to admit. And it all keeps coming back to the same place. Not New Mexico, not California, not the coast of China. Oregon, a row of dry caves, and a wind-blown rock shelter in the high desert where the dirt finally surrendered evidence the field could not simply dismiss. And the whole comfortable story began to fall apart at the seams. Somewhere out there right now, in dirt nobody has touched yet. The next piece is already waiting for the next person to dig deep enough to uncover it. So, who broke open a mastodon's bones in California 130,700 years ago, then left their stones behind and disappeared? Drop your theory in the comments below, because the honest answer right now is that nobody knows. If this hit you the way it hit us, tap subscribe, hit the like button, and click the next video on your screen, because the next excavation is already underway. And when it surfaces, we will be the first to take you through exactly what they found.